Margaret Thompson had been counting pennies for 8 months. Every morning, she would check the small glass jar on her kitchen counter, where she collected loose change from grocery shopping and her monthly pension check. The jar sat next to a faded newspaper clipping that she had carefully cut out and taped to the wall. The headline read, "World-renowned pianist to perform at Carnegie Hall." At 65, Margaret lived alone in a tiny house on Maple Street in Millfield, Ohio. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual Corn Festival, and where dreams of visiting New York City seemed as distant as traveling to the moon. Her house was small but clean, filled with the thousands of books she had collected during her 40-year career as the town librarian. Every evening after dinner, Margaret would sit in her favorite armchair and look at that newspaper clipping. She would run her fingers over the words, imagining what it would be like to hear professional piano music performed live. She had never been to a real concert before. In Millfield, the closest thing to live music was old Mrs. Peterson playing hymns at the Methodist Church on Sundays. Margaret's love for classical music had started when she was just 7 years old. Her grandmother had owned an old radio that could barely pick up the classical station from Columbus. Every Saturday afternoon, they would sit together on the front porch, listening to the scratchy broadcasts of piano concertos and symphonies. Her grandmother would hum along, and sometimes she would tell Margaret stories about the great composers and their music. Music, her grandmother used to say, is the language that speaks to the soul. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, young or old. When you hear something beautiful, it touches something deep inside you. Those words had stayed with Margaret her entire life. Even after her grandmother passed away when Margaret was 12, she continued listening to classical music whenever she could. She saved up her allowance to buy a small transistor radio, and later, when she got her first job at the library, she spent her lunch breaks listening to classical stations on the old radio in the break room. Working at the library had been perfect. For Margaret, she loved helping people find books, organizing the shelves, and creating reading programs for children. But her favorite part of the job was during the quiet, afternoon hours when she could play classical music softly in the background. She knew every piece by heart, the way Chopin's melodies could make you feel like you were floating, how Beethoven's symphonies could fill you with hope, and how Mozart's concertos could make even the cloudiest day seem bright. When Margaret retired 2 years ago, she thought her dream of hearing live classical music would remain just that, a dream. Concert tickets were expensive, and New York City seemed impossibly far away and complicated for someone like her who had never traveled beyond the neighboring counties. She had never even been on an airplane, but then came that newspaper article. The writer mentioned that Carnegie Hall was doing something special, offering discounted tickets to people who couldn't normally afford them. Margaret read that paragraph over and over again. Could this really be her chance? She started saving immediately. She cut back on her grocery shopping, buying generic brands instead of name brands. She stopped her subscription to the local newspaper and started reading it at the library instead. She even gave up her one small luxury, the flavored coffee creamer she liked to add to her morning cup. Margaret told no one about her plan. The people in Millfield were kind, but she worried they might think she was being foolish. A 65-year-old retired librarian traveling alone to New York City for a piano concert? It did sound a bit crazy, even to her. As the months passed, the jar slowly filled with coins and crumpled dollar bills. Margaret would count the money every Sunday evening, her heart racing as the total grew closer to what she needed. She had called Carnegie Hall 3 times to ask about ticket prices and the special program. Each time, the person on the phone was patient and kind, explaining the process and encouraging her to apply. Finally, in late spring, Margaret had enough money. With shaking hands, she filled out the application for the community outreach program. She wrote a simple letter explaining that she had loved classical music her whole life, but had never been able to afford concert tickets. She mailed the application on a Tuesday and then waited. The acceptance letter arrived 2 weeks later. Margaret was watering her tomato plants when the mail carrier, Bob Jenkins, walked up her driveway with a grin on his face. "Got something special for you today, Margaret," he said, handing her an envelope with the Carnegie Hall logo in the corner. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the letter. When she read the words, "We are pleased to inform you," she sat down, right there on her front steps, and cried. Bob, who had known Margaret since they were in high school together, sat down beside her. "Good news?" he asked gently. "The best news," Margaret whispered. "I'm going to hear piano music at Carnegie Hall." The weeks leading up to the concert passed in a blur of preparation and worry. Margaret bought a bus ticket to New York City. Her first trip anywhere beyond Ohio. She borrowed a small suitcase from her neighbor and carefully packed her best dress, a navy blue floral print that she had worn to church for the past 5 years. She polished her only pair of dress shoes until they gleamed. Margaret studied maps of New York City and subway routes until she could navigate them in her sleep. She practiced introducing herself to strangers, knowing that everything about the city would be different from small-town life. She even went to the library and checked out books about Carnegie Hall, learning about its history and the famous musicians who had performed there. The night before her trip, Margaret could barely sleep. She kept getting up to check her small alarm clock, worried that she might oversleep and miss the bus. She had packed and repacked her purse 3 times, making sure she had her ticket, her ID, and the small amount of emergency money she had set aside. As she finally drifted off to sleep around 3 in the morning, Margaret thought about her grandmother. She wished more than anything that she could share this moment with her. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice saying, "Music is the language that speaks to the soul." Tomorrow, Margaret would finally hear that language spoken in the most beautiful concert hall in the world. She had no idea that her simple dream of hearing beautiful music would turn into something far more extraordinary than she could ever imagine. Alexander Benedetti adjusted his silk bow tie for the 3rd time as he stood in the luxurious backstage area of Carnegie Hall. At 35, he had everything a classical musician could dream of: international fame, a recording contract worth millions, and the kind of reputation that made concert halls around the world compete for his performances. Tonight's concert would add another $50,000 to his already impressive bank account. The backstage mirror reflected a man who looked like he had stepped out of a fashion magazine. His perfectly styled dark hair, expensive Italian suit, and custom-made shoes worth more than most people's monthly rent all spoke of a life lived at the very top of the music world. Alexander had grown accustomed to luxury, and more importantly, he had grown accustomed to the admiration and respect that came with being considered one of the world's finest pianists. Alexander's assistant, Monica, hurried over with his usual pre-concert coffee, a special blend that cost $30 per cup and was flown in from Italy specifically for his performances. She carried a tablet showing his packed schedule for the next 6 months. Concerts in Vienna, Tokyo, London, and Sydney. Each venue more prestigious than the last, each audience more sophisticated and wealthy. "The hall is completely sold out tonight," Monica reported, scrolling through her notes. "We have the usual VIP section filled with music critics, wealthy patrons, and several board members from major symphony orchestras. There's also talk that a talent scout from Deutsche Grammophon might be in attendance." Alexander nodded, barely listening. He had heard the same report hundreds of times before. Sold-out crowds, important people in the audience, critics ready to write glowing reviews. It had all become routine. What bothered him tonight was something Monica had mentioned earlier. "Remind me again about this community outreach nonsense," Alexander said, his voice carrying the slightest hint of irritation. Monica checked her tablet. "Carnegie Hall has partnered with a local charity to offer discounted tickets to people who normally couldn't afford them. It's part of their public relations program. About 50 seats were made available at reduced prices." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had specifically chosen to perform at venues like Carnegie Hall because of the sophisticated audiences they attracted. The last thing he wanted was to perform for people who didn't understand the subtle complexities of classical music. In his mind, true appreciation for his art required years of education, cultural refinement, and most importantly, the kind of background that prepared someone to recognize genius when they heard it. I suppose we'll have to deal with people taking flash photography and clapping at inappropriate times, Alexander muttered, running his fingers through his hair. This wasn't the first time Alexander had expressed these views. Over the years, he had become increasingly particular about his audiences. He preferred performing for people who understood music theory, who could recognize the technical difficulty of the pieces he played, and who appreciated the years of training and natural talent that separated him from ordinary musicians. Alexander's rise to fame had been swift and impressive. Born into a wealthy family in Boston, he had shown musical talent from an early age. His parents, both successful doctors, had spared no expense in nurturing his gift. Private lessons with world-renowned teachers, attendance at the most prestigious music schools, and summers spent studying in Europe had all contributed to his development as a musician. By the time he was 18, Alexander was already performing with major symphony orchestras. By 25, he had won every major piano competition worth entering. His recordings consistently topped classical music charts, and music critics regularly described him as a once-in-a-generation talent and the future of classical piano. But success had changed Alexander in ways that even he didn't fully recognize. The constant praise, the luxury lifestyle, and the rarefied world of high-end classical music had gradually separated him from ordinary people and ordinary experiences. He had begun to believe that his talent made him fundamentally different from, and superior to most people. Alexander's social circle consisted entirely of other successful musicians, wealthy patrons of the arts, and cultural elite who moved in the same expensive circles. He lived in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, drove cars that cost more than most people's houses, and dined at restaurants where a single meal could feed a family for a week. More troubling was how Alexander had begun to view music itself. What had once been a source of joy and personal expression had become a way to demonstrate his superiority over others. He chose pieces not because they moved him emotionally, but because they were technically challenging enough to showcase his abilities. He had lost touch with the simple power of music to connect with people on a human level. Tonight's program was typical of Alexander's recent performances. He had selected pieces that were known to be extremely difficult, Chopin's most complex ballades, Liszt's most demanding etudes, and Rachmaninoff's most technically challenging concertos. These were pieces that would impress other musicians and serious classical music enthusiasts, but they were also pieces that could feel cold and distant to listeners who simply wanted to experience beautiful music. As Alexander prepared for the performance, he found himself increasingly annoyed by the thought of the charity case audience members who would be sitting in his concert hall. He imagined them dressed inappropriately, talking during quiet passages, and generally failing to appreciate the sophistication of what they were about to witness. Monica approached with the final pre-performance briefing. The house manager mentioned that some of the community outreach guests have already arrived. They seem very excited to be here. Alexander glanced toward the stage entrance, where he could occasionally catch glimpses of the audience filing into their seats. Through the small gap in the curtain, he spotted exactly what he had expected to see: people who clearly didn't belong in a venue like Carnegie Hall. There was an elderly woman in what appeared to be a homemade dress, clutching a worn handbag, and looking around with wide eyes like a tourist. There were working-class families dressed in their Sunday best, taking pictures with their phones and pointing excitedly at the ornate ceiling. There were younger people who had probably never been to a classical concert before, talking and laughing with the kind of enthusiasm that Alexander found inappropriate for such a refined setting. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Alexander said to Monica, shaking his head. "Look at them. They have no idea how to behave in a concert hall. They're treating this like some kind of entertainment show instead of a serious artistic performance." What Alexander couldn't see, and wouldn't have cared about if he could, were the individual stories behind those faces. He didn't know about the retired teacher who had saved for months to afford her ticket, or the young music student who was experiencing live classical music for the first time, or the elderly man who reminded him of his late wife's love for piano. Music. To Alexander, these people represented everything that was wrong with attempts to democratize classical music. In his view, true art was meant for people who could understand and appreciate it on a sophisticated level. Opening concert halls to ordinary people was, in his mind, like hanging a Picasso in a fast food restaurant. As the time for his performance approached, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He would use tonight's concert to demonstrate the vast difference between real musical sophistication and amateur appreciation. If these people wanted to see what professional classical music was really about, he would show them exactly why it required years of training and cultural education to truly understand. He had no idea that among the audience members he was so casually dismissing sat someone whose musical abilities would soon humble him in ways he never thought possible. The concert began exactly as Alexander had planned. The moment he walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. He moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this same routine hundreds of times before. His bow was perfect, his posture commanding, and his smile just charming enough to remind everyone that they were in the presence of greatness. Margaret sat in her seat in the back section, her heart pounding with excitement. She had never seen a real grand piano up close before, and the massive Steinway on stage looked like something from a dream. The concert hall itself was more beautiful than she had ever imagined. The golden walls, the crystal chandeliers, and the ornate ceiling made her feel like she had stepped into a palace. Alexander began with Chopin's Ballade Note 1, one of his signature pieces. His fingers moved across the keys with mechanical precision, hitting every note exactly as it was written. The audience listened with the kind of respectful silence that Alexander preferred. No inappropriate clapping, no whispered conversations. Just the pure sound of his music filling the magnificent hall. But as Margaret listened, something felt different than she had expected. The music was technically perfect, every note clean, every passage played with impressive speed and accuracy. Yet somehow it felt cold to her. She had spent so many years listening to classical music on her old radio, imagining what it would sound like when played by a master musician. She had expected to feel the same emotional connection she experienced when listening at home, but stronger and more powerful. Instead, the music felt distant, almost mechanical. Alexander played each piece like he was solving a mathematical equation, rather than sharing something beautiful with the audience. Margaret found herself thinking about her grandmother's words. Music is the language that speaks to the soul. Tonight, it felt like Alexander was speaking a different language entirely. During the first half of the concert, Margaret noticed that Alexander barely looked at his audience. He stared at the keys, occasionally glancing up with a practiced smile, but never really connecting with the people who had come to hear him play. Between pieces, he would bow politely and wait for the applause to die down before continuing. There was no warmth, no sense that he was sharing something personal or meaningful. When intermission arrived, the audience began filing out of their seats to stretch their legs and visit the lobby. Margaret had never been to a concert before, so she wasn't sure what people usually did during intermission. She watched as elegantly dressed audience members chatted about wine and upcoming vacations, their conversations flowing with the kind of easy sophistication that came from attending events like this regularly. Margaret felt out of place among these people, but she was too fascinated by the concert hall itself to worry much about fitting in. While others headed to the lobby, she remained in her seat, simply taking in the beauty of the space. The stage looked even more impressive now that it was empty, with the grand piano sitting under the warm stage lights like a sleeping giant. After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of her. Margaret had never seen a real concert grand piano up close, and she wondered if she might be able to get a better look at it. She noticed that some audience members were walking closer to the stage area, taking pictures and chatting with friends, slowly. Margaret made her way down the aisle toward the front of the hall. With each step, the piano grew larger and more magnificent. She had spent her entire life playing on an old upright piano in her basement, an instrument that had been donated to her by the church when they upgraded their equipment 20 years ago. The Steinway on stage was like comparing a bicycle to a luxury car. When Margaret reached the front section, she stopped and simply stared. The piano was beautiful in a way that took her breath away. The polished black surface reflected the stage. Lights like still water, and the keys seemed to glow with an inner light. She could see her reflection in the piano surface, and for a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to sit at that bench and touch those keys. Margaret didn't realize she had moved closer to the stage until she found herself standing right at the edge, near the small steps that led up to the performance area. The piano was only a few feet away now, and she could see every detail, the way the light caught the edges of the keys, the elegant curves of the piano's body, and the small plaque that bore the Steinway name. Without really thinking about it, Margaret took one small step up onto the stage area. She told herself she would just get a tiny bit closer, just enough to really see the instrument that had produced such incredible music. She had no intention of touching anything or causing any trouble. That's when she heard the sharp voice behind her. "Excuse me, miss, but you can't be up there." Margaret turned to see a security guard approaching quickly, his expression stern and official. She immediately felt embarrassed, realizing that she had probably broken some important rule that everyone else understood, but she didn't. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said, her cheeks turning red. "I just wanted to see the piano up close. I've never seen one like this before." The security guard, a middle-aged man named Frank, who had worked at Carnegie Hall for 15 years, wasn't particularly harsh, but he had his job to do. "I understand, ma'am, but audience members aren't allowed on the stage area. It's for insurance reasons and to protect the instruments." Margaret nodded quickly and started to step back down, feeling foolish for not knowing the rules. But as she turned to leave, she heard another voice, one that made her stop in her tracks. "What seems to be the problem here?" Alexander Benedetti had emerged from backstage, probably to check on his piano before the second half of the concert. He was still wearing his concert attire, and his presence seemed to fill the entire space around the stage. Margaret had seen him perform from her seat in the back, but up close, he was even more imposing. Frank, the security guard, immediately straightened up. "Mr. Benedetti, I was just explaining to this lady that audience members need to stay in the seating area." Alexander looked at Margaret for the first time, taking in her simple dress, her worn handbag, and her clearly embarrassed expression. In that moment, all of his pre-concert frustrations about the community outreach program came flooding back. Here was exactly the kind of person he had been worried about, someone who clearly didn't understand proper concert etiquette and was treating the stage like a museum exhibit. "I see," Alexander said, his voice carrying a tone that made Margaret feel even smaller. "And I suppose you thought you would just come up and have a look around?" Margaret felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm terribly sorry. I've never seen a piano like this before. I didn't mean any harm." Alexander's expression grew colder. The few other audience members who were still in the hall area had begun to notice the commotion and were watching from a distance. This was exactly the kind of disruption he had been expecting from the charity ticket holders. "A piano like this?" Alexander repeated, his voice rising slightly. "This is a Steinway Model D concert grand, worth more than most people's houses. It's not a prop or a tourist attraction. It's a precision instrument that requires respect and understanding." Margaret nodded quickly, trying to back away, but Alexander wasn't finished. Something about her presence on his stage, combined with his frustration about performing for an unsophisticated audience, pushed him over the edge. "Perhaps," Alexander continued, his voice now loud enough for other people to hear clearly, "you would be more comfortable at a venue that's more suited to your background. Maybe somewhere with a jukebox or a player piano. This is Carnegie Hall, not a community center." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had spent 8 months saving for this ticket, had dreamed of this evening for longer than Alexander had been alive, and had approached his piano with nothing but respect and wonder. Now she stood there, humiliated in front of strangers, being treated like she didn't belong in a place where music was performed, but something unexpected happened in that moment of humiliation. Instead of backing down or running away in embarrassment, Margaret felt a different emotion rising inside her. It wasn't anger exactly, but something deeper and more powerful. It was the feeling she got when she sat at her old piano in the basement and played the pieces she loved. When music transported her to a place where her humble circumstances didn't matter, Margaret looked directly at Alexander, her embarrassment slowly being replaced by quiet dignity. "I may not know all the rules about concert halls," she said softly, "but I do know something about music." Alexander laughed, a sound that carried more condescension than humor. "Oh, really? And what exactly do you know about music?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret realized that this moment would either define her as someone who backed down from confrontation or someone who stood up for what she loved most in the world. Alexander's question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. The few audience members who had gathered around the stage area during intermission could sense the tension building. Some pulled out their phones, instinctively knowing that whatever was about to happen would be worth recording. Others simply stood frozen, uncomfortable with the obvious confrontation unfolding before them. Margaret felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but something deeper was stirring inside her. For most of her life, she had been the kind of person who avoided conflict, who apologized even when she wasn't wrong, who made herself smaller to avoid bothering other people. But standing there in front of this arrogant man who was treating her like she didn't belong, Margaret felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: defiance. "I know that music isn't about showing off," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know that it's about sharing something beautiful with other people." Alexander laughed, and the sound was sharp and cold. "Sharing something beautiful? How wonderfully poetic. But you see, music at this level isn't about feelings and poetry. It's about years of rigorous training, technical precision, and natural talent that can't be taught or faked." He gestured toward the magnificent Steinway piano behind him. "This instrument represents hundreds of years of craftsmanship and musical tradition. It's not something you can just walk up to and play because you love music. It requires respect, understanding, and most importantly, skill." Margaret looked at the piano, then back at Alexander. "I do respect it," she said. "I've respected music my entire life. Maybe I don't have fancy training or expensive clothes, but that doesn't mean I don't understand what music is really about." Alexander's smile grew wider and more condescending. "Really? And what do you think music is really about?" "It's about touching people's hearts," Margaret replied without hesitation. "It's about taking the feelings that everyone has but can't put into words and giving them a voice through melody and harmony. It's about connecting with something bigger than yourself." "How charming," Alexander said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'm afraid that understanding music requires a bit more than romantic notions about touching hearts. It requires technical knowledge, years of practice, and the kind of sophisticated training that separates real musicians from people who simply enjoy listening to music." The audience members were growing more uncomfortable by the minute. This wasn't the kind of sophisticated cultural experience they had come to Carnegie Hall to enjoy. Several people began moving away, not wanting to be part of whatever was happening. But others stayed, drawn by the same instinct that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. Frank, the security guard, shifted nervously from foot to foot. He could see that the situation was escalating, but he wasn't sure how to intervene. Mr. Benedetti was the star performer, and the hall's management would not be happy if Frank offended him. But the older woman seemed harmless enough, and watching her being humiliated in public didn't feel right. Alexander, meanwhile, was enjoying himself. All of his frustration about performing for unsophisticated audiences was finding an outlet in this confrontation. Here was a perfect opportunity to demonstrate the vast difference between real musical understanding and amateur appreciation. "Tell you what," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly through the space around the stage, "since you seem so confident about your musical understanding, why don't you show us? Why don't you sit down at this piano and demonstrate what real music sounds like?" Margaret's eyes widened. "I couldn't possibly." Oh, but I insist, Alexander continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the growing crowd of onlookers, we have someone here who believes that musical understanding comes from the heart rather than from training and talent. I think we should give her the opportunity to prove her point. Several people in the audience exchanged worried glances. This was becoming cruel, and everyone could see it except Alexander himself. But no one seemed willing to speak up and stop what was happening. Come now, Alexander pressed. Surely someone who understands music so well wouldn't be afraid to demonstrate their abilities. Unless, of course, you're beginning to realize that there's a difference between appreciating music and actually being able to create it. Margaret felt trapped. Every instinct told her to apologize, back down, and hurry away from this humiliating situation. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, some pitying, some curious, some clearly expecting her to embarrass herself. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent her whole life avoiding. But then she thought about her grandmother and the countless hours they had spent together listening to classical music on that old radio. She thought about the 47 years she had spent practicing piano in her basement, playing the same pieces over and over again because they brought her joy and comfort. She thought about all the times she had closed her eyes while playing and imagined what it would be like to share her music with other people. You really want me to play? Margaret asked, her voice stronger now. Absolutely, Alexander replied, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of mock generosity. Please be my guest. Show everyone what music means to you. Margaret looked around at the faces watching her. She saw curiosity, pity, anticipation, and in a few cases something that looked like encouragement. Near the back of the group, she noticed a young girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, holding her mother's hand and watching with wide, innocent eyes. The sight of that little girl reminded Margaret of herself at the same age, sitting on her grandmother's porch and dreaming about beautiful music. What would her grandmother think if she saw Margaret backing down now, allowing someone to dismiss her love of music as worthless simply because she hadn't had the same opportunities as others? All right, Margaret said, her voice clear and determined. I'll play something for you. Alexander's grin widened. Wonderful. This should be educational for everyone. As Margaret walked toward the piano bench, Alexander continued his commentary. What we're about to witness, ladies and gentlemen, is why classical music requires years of dedicated study and natural talent. Music isn't something that can be mastered through good intentions and romantic feelings about beauty. Margaret reached the piano and paused, her hand resting on the bench. The instrument was even more magnificent up close than it had appeared from her seat in the audience. The polished surface reflected the stage lights like a mirror, and the keys seemed to glow with an inner light. Please, Alexander said with exaggerated politeness, take all the time you need to prepare. I'm sure everyone is eager to hear what real musical understanding sounds like when it comes from the heart rather than from proper training. Margaret sat down and adjusted the bench, a movement so natural and practiced that it caught Alexander slightly off guard. Most amateur pianists would fumble with the bench height or sit awkwardly, but Margaret's positioning was perfect. Any particular piece you'd like to attempt? Alexander asked, his tone making it clear that he expected her to choose something. Simple and well-known. Margaret placed her hands gently on the keys without pressing them down. She could feel the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips and the familiar weight and balance that told her this was an instrument capable of producing the most beautiful sounds imaginable. I think I'll play Rachmaninoff, Margaret said quietly. The statement sent a ripple of surprise through the watching audience. Even people who didn't know much about classical music had heard of Rachmaninoff and knew that his compositions were among the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Alexander's confident smile faltered for just a moment. Rachmaninoff? Which piece? Piano Concerto No. 2, Margaret replied, her voice steady and calm. Now Alexander looked genuinely surprised. Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto was one of the most difficult and emotionally complex pieces ever written for piano. It required not just technical skill but deep musical maturity and understanding. Surely this woman couldn't be serious about attempting such a challenging work. "That's quite ambitious," Alexander said, trying to regain his composure. "Are you certain you want to attempt something so demanding?" Margaret looked up at him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she smiled. "Music isn't about playing it safe," she said. "It's about being brave enough to share what's in your heart, even when people tell you that you're not good enough." With that, Margaret positioned her hands over the keys, took a deep breath, and prepared to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary talents are hidden in the most ordinary places. Margaret walked slowly toward the piano bench, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the concert hall could hear it. The stage lights felt warm on her face, but her hands were trembling, not from nerves this time, but from 47. Years of buried dreams suddenly rushing to the surface all at once. Alexander stood with his arms crossed, that smug smile still playing on his lips. He had positioned himself where he could watch Margaret's inevitable failure up close. In his mind, this would be over quickly. She would sit down, maybe play a simple melody with one finger, realize she was completely out of her depth, and hurry off the stage in embarrassment. It would be a perfect lesson for everyone watching about the difference between real musicians and people who simply thought they loved music. The audience members who had remained in the hall during intermission were now paying attention. Word was spreading quickly that something unusual was happening on stage. People were pulling out their phones, some to record what they expected to be an amusing moment, others texting friends about the drama unfolding at Carnegie Hall. Margaret reached the piano bench and paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the smooth wooden surface. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and suddenly she wasn't standing on the stage at Carnegie Hall anymore. She was 7 years old again, sitting on her grandmother's front porch, listening to scratchy radio broadcasts of piano concertos while her grandmother hummed along. "Music is the language that speaks to the soul," her grandmother had said. "It doesn't matter where you come from or what you wear. When you play from your heart, people will listen." Margaret opened her eyes and sat down at the bench. The piano seat was exactly the right height, and when she placed her feet on the pedals, everything felt perfectly natural, as if she had been meant to sit at this instrument her entire life. She adjusted the bench slightly, a movement so natural and professional that Alexander's smile faltered just a bit. She placed her hands gently on the keys without pressing them down, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. These keys were so different from the yellowed, chipped keys of her basement piano. These felt alive somehow, ready to produce sounds more beautiful than anything she had ever experienced. Margaret knew exactly what piece she was going to play. It had been her favorite since she was 16 years old, back when she was still dreaming of studying at Juilliard before life changed everything. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most emotionally powerful and technically demanding pieces ever written for piano. She had played this concerto thousands of times in her basement, but always alone, always in secret. She had memorized every note, every dynamic marking, every subtle expression that made the piece come alive. But she had never played it on an instrument worthy of the music itself. Margaret's fingers found the opening notes, and what happened next changed everything. The first chord emerged from the Steinway like a voice from heaven, rich, full, and powerful in a way that Margaret had never experienced before. The sound seemed to fill every corner of the concert hall, wrapping around the audience like a warm embrace. But it wasn't just the quality of the sound that was shocking. It was the way Margaret was producing it. Her touch was absolutely perfect. Every note was controlled, precise, and filled with emotion. Her hands moved across the keys with the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught or faked. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur, this was the playing of someone who understood the piano on a level that went far beyond technical training. Alexander's smug expression disappeared completely. His mouth actually fell open as he realized what he was hearing. This wasn't possible. The woman sitting at his piano was producing sounds that rivaled his own performance earlier that evening. But how? Who was she? Where had she trained? As Margaret continued playing, the opening theme of the concerto began to unfold with breathtaking beauty. She wasn't just hitting the right notes, she was telling a story with the music. Every phrase had meaning, every melody had emotion behind it. The music seemed to flow from her hands as naturally as breathing. The few audience members who had stayed for intermission stood frozen, completely mesmerized. One by one, others began returning from the lobby, drawn by the sound of music unlike anything they had heard that evening. Even during Alexander's technically perfect performance, the music had felt distant and cold. But this was different. This was music that reached into your chest and squeezed your heart. Margaret was completely lost in the music now. Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't notice. She was experiencing something she had dreamed about for nearly 50 years, the chance to play beautiful music on a beautiful instrument for people who could hear it. All those years of practicing alone in her basement, all those dreams she had buried when she chose family responsibility over personal ambition, all of it was pouring out through her fingertips. The technical demands of Rachmaninoff's concerto were enormous. The piece required incredible finger strength, perfect timing, and the ability to play multiple complex melodies simultaneously. It was the kind of piece that separated professional pianists from everyone else. And Margaret was playing it flawlessly, but more than that, she was playing it with a depth of emotion that made Alexander's earlier performance seem shallow by comparison. When Margaret played the concerto's famous romantic theme, it sounded like someone singing about lost love and found hope. When she reached the dramatic climax of the first movement, it felt like the music might lift the entire audience right out of their seats. Alexander stood there, watching his entire understanding of music and talent crumble before his eyes. Everything he thought he knew about who deserved to be on a stage like this, about what made someone a real musician, about the difference between himself and ordinary people. All of it was being proven wrong by a 65-year-old woman in a simple dress. The other audience members were having their own revelations. Many of them had assumed, just as Alexander had, that the community outreach guests were there as charity cases, people who couldn't normally afford concert tickets, and probably wouldn't really understand what they were hearing. The idea that one of these ordinary people could produce music this extraordinary challenged everything they thought they knew about talent and worth. Margaret moved into the second movement of the concerto, a beautiful, melancholy melody that seemed to capture all the sadness and beauty of a life lived quietly but fully. Her technique was absolutely flawless, but it was her emotional connection to the music that made the performance truly special. She played like someone who had experienced real loss, real sacrifice, and real love. As she played, Margaret thought about all the paths her life had taken. She thought about the dreams she had given up to raise her younger siblings after their parents died. She thought about the years of working multiple jobs while secretly practicing piano in whatever spare moments she could find. She thought about the music that had sustained her through loneliness, disappointment, and the quiet struggles of an ordinary life, but mostly, she thought about her grandmother's words. Music is the language that speaks to the soul. Tonight, finally, Margaret was speaking that language fluently and beautifully, sharing it with people who could understand its power. Alexander realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of music and himself. This woman, whom he had dismissed and humiliated just minutes earlier, was proving that true musical talent had nothing to do with expensive training or social status. It had everything to do with the ability to connect with something deep and universal through the language of sound. As Margaret approached the end of the movement, building toward the dramatic finale that would either make or break the entire performance, everyone in Carnegie Hall held their breath. They were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a musical performance, but a revelation about the nature of talent, dignity, and the power of dreams that refuse to die. As Margaret continued to play, the music seemed to unlock memories that had been buried for decades. Each note carried the weight of a story that no one in Carnegie Hall could have imagined. The beautiful melodies flowing from her fingers weren't just technically perfect, they were filled with the pain and sacrifice of a life that had taken a completely different path. than anyone would have expected. The audience watched in stunned silence as Margaret's performance grew more emotional. Tears were streaming down her face, but her playing never faltered. If anything, the emotion seemed to make her music even more powerful. As if decades of suppressed feelings were finally finding their voice through the piano, Alexander stood, frozen at the edge of the stage, his mind racing to understand what he was witnessing. This wasn't possible. The level of skill Margaret was displaying required years of intensive training, the kind that only came from studying at the world's most prestigious music schools. But how could a retired librarian from a small Ohio town have that kind of background? In the third row, an elderly woman named Helen suddenly gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. She was a longtime supporter of music education programs, and something about Margaret's playing had triggered a memory. The style, the interpretation, the way Margaret's hands moved across the keys, it all seemed familiar somehow. "Oh my goodness," Helen whispered to her husband. "I think I know who she is," but Helen's realization would have to wait. Margaret was approaching the most technically demanding section of the concerto, a passage that required incredible finger strength and coordination. Most professional pianists found this section challenging even after years of practice. Yet Margaret played it with a fluidity and confidence that left everyone breathless. As the music swirled around the concert hall, Margaret was lost in memories of a very different life. She was 16 again, sitting in a practice room at the Cleveland Institute of Music, working through this same piece for hours every day. Her teacher, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, had told her that she had never heard a student play Rachmaninoff with such natural emotion and technical ability. Margaret, Dr. Martinez had said after one particularly beautiful practice session, "You have something special. This kind of musical gift comes along maybe once in a generation. With the right training and opportunities, you could be performing on the world's greatest stages." Those words had filled 16-year-old Margaret with dreams that seemed almost too wonderful to believe. She had been accepted to the Juilliard School in New York City with a full scholarship, something that happened to only the most exceptional young musicians. Her future had been bright and clearly mapped out: 4 years at Juilliard, followed by a career as a concert pianist, traveling the world and sharing her music with audiences everywhere. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Margaret was in her first semester at Juilliard when she received the phone call that changed everything. Her parents had been driving home from her younger brother's soccer game on a rainy November evening when their car skidded on wet leaves and crashed into a tree. Both of them died instantly, leaving behind not just Margaret, but her 3 younger siblings: Thomas, who was 14, Rachel, who was 12, and little Amy, who was only 8 years old. The family had no other relatives capable of taking care of 3 children. Margaret's elderly grandmother was still alive but too frail to handle the responsibility. There were no aunts or uncles who could step in. The children would have to go into foster care, probably separated from each other. Unless Margaret made a choice that would change her life forever, she could still remember sitting in the dean's office at Juilliard, explaining that she would have to leave school to take care of her siblings. The dean, a kind man named Professor Williams, had tried to find alternatives. There were programs for students in crisis situations, he explained. There might be ways to arrange care for her siblings while she finished her education, but Margaret had already made her decision. Her siblings needed stability and love during the most difficult time of their lives. They needed someone who would put their welfare above everything else. They needed their big sister to come home and be the parent they had lost. "Music will always be there," Margaret had told Professor Williams, even though saying the words felt like cutting out her own heart. "But my family needs me now." The transition from promising music student to full-time guardian had been devastating in ways that Margaret was still discovering. She moved back to Millfield and got a job at the library, working extra hours whenever possible to support the family. She sold their parents' house and moved everyone into a smaller place that they could afford on her modest salary. Thomas had been angry and rebellious, blaming Margaret for decisions she had no control over. Rachel had become quiet and withdrawn, losing herself in books and barely speaking for months. Little Amy had nightmares every night and refused to let Margaret out of her sight, taking care of 3 grieving children while dealing with her own. Loss had required every ounce of strength Margaret possessed. The hardest part had been giving up music. For the first few years, Margaret was too busy and too emotionally drained to even think about playing piano. The old upright piano in their basement sat silent, gathering dust while Margaret focused entirely on keeping her family together. It wasn't until Thomas graduated from high school and Amy started middle school that Margaret finally felt like she could breathe again. Late one evening, when everyone was asleep, she had crept down to the basement and sat at the old piano bench. Her fingers found the keys almost automatically, and she began playing a simple batch piece that she had learned as a child. The music that came out was rusty and imperfect, but it was also beautiful in a way that surprised her. The years of struggle and sacrifice had given her music a depth of emotion that she had never possessed as a teenager. She played until sunrise that night, rediscovering the part of herself that she had set aside for her family. From that night forward, Margaret had returned to music as a secret refuge. Every evening after everyone was asleep, she would practice on the old piano in the basement. She taught herself pieces from memory, bought sheet music when she could afford it, and slowly rebuilt her technical skills. But she never told anyone about her musical background or her abandoned dreams. Now, sitting at the Steinway in Carnegie Hall, all of those memories and emotions were pouring out through her fingertips. The sacrifice, the loneliness, the love for her siblings, the grief for her lost dreams, and the quiet joy she had found in playing alone, it was all there in the music. Alexander watched Margaret's performance with growing amazement and horror. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't just witnessing great playing, he was seeing the musical expression of an entire life story. This woman had given up everything for her family, had spent decades playing alone in basements, while he had enjoyed fame and fortune for talents that now seemed shallow by comparison. The audience, too, was beginning to sense that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't just a good performance or even a great one. This was music that came from the deepest places of human experience, from loss and love and sacrifice and the quiet determination to keep beauty alive even in the darkest circumstances. Margaret approached the climax of the concerto, the moment where all of the musical themes came together in a powerful emotional statement. As she played, she thought about all the concerts she had never given, all the audiences she had never moved, all the recognition she had never received. But she also thought about the life she had chosen instead, raising her siblings, seeing them graduate and start families of their own, finding small moments of joy in ordinary days. Thomas was now a successful engineer with 2 children of his own. Rachel had become a teacher, inspired by Margaret's example of quiet service to others. Amy was a nurse caring for sick children with the same gentle love that Margaret had shown her during the darkest period of her life. Margaret had missed her chance at musical fame, but she had created something even more valuable, a family that was whole and loving because of her sacrifice. The music she was playing now carried all of that love and loss and redemption, making it more powerful than any technically perfect performance could ever be. The silence that followed Margaret's final note was unlike anything Carnegie Hall had ever experienced. It wasn't the polite quiet that usually came after a performance while people decided whether to clap. This was something deeper, a moment when an entire room full of people realized they had just witnessed something that would change them forever. For nearly 10 seconds, nobody moved. Margaret sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting gently on the keys, tears streaming down. Her face? She wasn't crying from sadness, but from a joy so pure it felt like her heart might burst. After 47 years of playing alone in her basement, she had finally been able to share her music with the world. Alexander stood frozen at the side of the stage, his face pale and his mouth still slightly open. Everything he thought he knew about music, about talent, about who deserved to be called a real musician, had been completely turned upside down in the space of 15 minutes. The woman he had mocked and dismissed had just delivered one of the most moving performances he had ever witnessed. in the audience. People were having their own moments of realization. Mrs. Chun, a wealthy patron who had been attending Carnegie Hall concerts for 30 years, felt tears running down her cheeks. She had heard the world's finest pianists perform in this very hall, but she had never experienced anything that touched her heart the way Margaret's playing just had. Behind her sat Robert, a young music critic from the New York Times who had come to write a routine review of Alexander's concert. He was frantically trying to find words to describe what he had just heard, but everything he wrote seemed inadequate. How do you capture the moment when someone's entire life story pours out through their fingertips? How do you describe music that doesn't just sound beautiful but feels like a conversation with your own soul? In the back section where Margaret had originally been sitting, a group of teenagers who had come as part of a school music program were staring at the stage in complete amazement. 15 minutes ago, they had been bored by Alexander's technically perfect but emotionally cold performance. They had been checking their phones and whispering to each other, wondering when the concert would be over, but Margaret's music had grabbed their attention in a way they didn't know was possible. They had never heard classical music that felt so alive, so connected to real human emotions. One of them, a 17-year-old named David, who had been forced to attend by his music teacher, found himself thinking that maybe he wanted to learn piano after all. Throughout the concert hall, similar transformations were taking place. People who had come to the concert as a social obligation were realizing that music could be something much more powerful than they had ever imagined. People who had been proud of their sophisticated taste in classical music were discovering that they had been listening to technique instead of heart. The community outreach guests, the people Alexander had been so concerned about, were having perhaps the most profound reactions of all. They recognized something in Margaret's performance that the wealthy regular patrons were only beginning to understand. Margaret's music spoke the language of ordinary people who had faced real struggles, made real sacrifices, and found ways to keep beauty alive in difficult circumstances. An elderly man named George, who worked as a janitor at a local school, wiped tears from his eyes. He had saved for 3 months to afford his discounted ticket, and he had been feeling out of place among all the well-dressed, sophisticated audience members. But Margaret's music reminded him that beauty and talent weren't owned by wealthy people. They belonged to anyone who had the courage to reach for them. Near the front of the hall, a middle-aged woman named Linda, who cleaned offices at night to support her family, was crying openly. She had brought her teenage daughter to the concert, hoping to expose her to something beautiful and inspiring. Neither of them had expected to witness a moment that would become one of the most important memories of their lives. But the most dramatic transformation was happening in Alexander himself. As he stood there watching Margaret bow her head in humble gratitude for what she had just experienced, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: shame. Not the small embarrassment of making a mistake during a performance, but the deep shame that comes from realizing you have been fundamentally wrong about something important. Alexander thought about all the times he had dismissed people like Margaret. He thought about the times he had complained about performing for unsophisticated audiences. He thought about how he had turned music into a way to prove his superiority, instead of a way to connect with other human beings. Looking at Margaret, now, still sitting at his piano with such dignity and grace despite the way he had treated her, Alexander realized that she was everything he had forgotten how to be. She was humble where he was arrogant. She was genuine where he was calculating. She was connected to the true spirit of music where he had become disconnected from everything except his own ego. The silence was finally broken by a single person clapping. It was Frank, the security guard, who had initially tried to remove Margaret from the stage. He had worked at Carnegie Hall for 15 years and had heard every famous pianist of his generation perform. He knew greatness when he heard it, and he knew that what Margaret had just done was something special. His clapping was joined by one person, then another, then another. But this wasn't the polite, measured applause that usually followed classical performances. This was something much more powerful, the kind of applause that comes from the heart rather than from social obligation. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic until it filled every corner of the massive hall. People were cheering, wiping away tears, and looking around at each other with expressions of amazement and joy. Margaret looked up from the piano, startled by the intensity of the response. She had never experienced anything like this. When she played in her basement, there was no applause except from the occasional neighbor's cat who wandered into her yard. Now hundreds of people were standing and clapping for her, and their faces showed genuine appreciation and emotion, but what moved Margaret the most wasn't the applause itself. It was the look in people's eyes. She could see that her music had touched something real in them, had connected with their own experiences of loss and hope and love. This was what her grandmother had meant. When she said music was the language that spoke to the soul, Alexander found himself clapping too, even though part of him wanted to disappear from embarrassment. With each clap, he felt a little more of his arrogance falling away, replaced by something he had lost somewhere along his path to fame: humility and genuine respect for the power of music to move people. The applause continued for nearly 10 minutes, with people refusing to sit down or stop clapping. It was as if they understood that they were part of something historic, something that would be talked about for years to come. This wasn't just a great performance. It was a moment when everyone in the room remembered why music mattered. As Margaret finally stood up from the piano bench, still overwhelmed by the response, she caught Alexander's eye. Instead of the condescension and dismissal she had seen there earlier, she now saw something completely different. She saw respect, admiration, and perhaps most importantly, she saw someone who had just learned an important lesson about the true nature of talent and worth. The evening that had started with Margaret being humiliated and dismissed was turning into something neither she nor anyone else in Carnegie Hall would ever forget. It was becoming a reminder that the most powerful music comes not from perfect technique or expensive training, but from a human heart that has something real to share with the world. As the thunderous applause finally began to fade, Alexander knew he had to do something. Standing there watching Margaret bow gracefully to the audience, he felt the weight of his earlier behavior crushing down on him. He had spent his entire career believing that talent and worth were measured by fame, training, and social status. In 15 minutes, this humble woman had shattered every assumption he had ever made about music and the people who truly understood it. Alexander walked slowly across the stage toward Margaret, his footsteps echoing in the gradually quieting hall. The audience watched in fascination, sensing that something important was about to happen. When he reached her, Alexander did something he hadn't done in years. He looked directly into someone's eyes without any trace of superiority or condescension. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect hall, "I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was wrong, and what you just shared with us was extraordinary." Margaret looked at him with surprise. She had expected anger or embarrassment from the famous pianist, not this genuine humility. "Thank you," she said simply, "but I think we both learned something tonight." Alexander nodded, then turned to face the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice stronger now, "I had planned to finish tonight's concert with a solo performance, but I think we can all agree that would be a mistake. Margaret, would you honor me by playing something together?" The suggestion sent a wave of excitement through the audience. A duet between the world-famous Alexander Benedetti and the mysterious woman who had just delivered the performance of a lifetime? It was the kind of moment that people would talk about for decades. Margaret hesitated for a moment. "I don't know if I remember any duet pieces well enough," she said. Alexander smiled, a real smile this time, not the practiced one he used for photographers. "What about Mozart's Sonata for 2 pianos? Do you know it?" Margaret's face lit up. It was one of her favorite pieces, one she had played countless times on her old upright piano, imagining what it would sound like with a second piano joining in. "I know it very well," she said. The Carnegie Hall staff quickly wheeled out a second piano, positioning it next to the Steinway so that Margaret and Alexander could face each other while they played. The audience watched in anticipation as the two pianists took their seats. the world-famous virtuoso and the retired librarian, who had just proven that talent could be found in the most unexpected places. They began together, Alexander taking the first piano part and Margaret the second. From the very first notes, it was clear that something magical was happening. Alexander's playing, which had felt cold and mechanical earlier in the evening, was now warm and expressive. Being paired with Margaret seemed to remind him of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Margaret, meanwhile, played with the same emotional depth she had shown during her solo performance, but now there was an additional joy in her music, the joy of finally being able to share her gift with another musician who appreciated it. The two pianos seemed to dance together, each melody weaving around the other in perfect harmony. As they played, both musicians were transformed. Alexander found himself listening to Margaret's musical choices and responding to them, something he rarely did even when performing with world-class orchestras. He was used to dominating musical partnerships, but with Margaret, he discovered the joy of true collaboration. For Margaret, playing with another pianist was a dream she had never dared to imagine might come true. In her basement, she had always played both parts of duets by herself, switching back and forth between the melodies. Now, hearing how the two parts fit together with another skilled musician was like discovering a new language. She had always known but never been able to speak fluently. The audience watched in amazement as the two very different performers created something beautiful together. It was a perfect metaphor for what had happened that evening, the breaking down of barriers between different kinds of people and the discovery that music could unite anyone who approached it with genuine passion and respect. When the Mozart sonata ended, the applause was even more enthusiastic than before. But this time, Alexander stood up immediately and gestured for Margaret to take a bow by herself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I have had the privilege of performing with orchestras around the world, but I have never had a more inspiring musical partner than Margaret Thompson." The audience erupted again, and this time Margaret felt confident enough to wave and smile at the crowd. She saw the faces of the community outreach guests, people like herself, who had saved and planned to be here, and she realized that her performance had shown them something important, that they belonged in places like this just as much as anyone else. But the evening's surprises weren't over yet. As the applause died down, a man in an expensive suit approached the stage. He was James Mitchell, a talent scout for one of the world's most prestigious classical music recording companies. He had been in the audience to evaluate Alexander's performance for a possible new recording contract, but Margaret's playing had completely changed his plans. "Miss Thompson," he called out, "I'm James Mitchell from Harmony Classical Records. I wonder if we might speak about the possibility of making a recording." Margaret looked confused. "A recording? Of me?" "Of course of you," James said with a smile. "What we heard tonight was extraordinary. There are millions of people who would love to experience what this audience just experienced." The audience began buzzing with excitement. The idea that this humble woman might become a recording artist seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Margaret herself looked overwhelmed by the possibility. Alexander stepped forward. "Margaret, you have a gift that deserves to be shared with the world. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Over the following weeks, Margaret's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. A recording of her Carnegie Hall performance, captured on someone's phone, was posted online and viewed millions of times within days. Major news outlets picked up the story of the retired librarian who shocked Carnegie Hall, and suddenly Margaret found herself receiving interview requests and concert invitations from around the world. But perhaps more importantly, Margaret's story became an inspiration to countless people who had hidden talents or abandoned dreams. Music schools reported increases in enrollment from older students. Community centers started piano programs for seniors. Libraries began hosting classical music appreciation events. Alexander, meanwhile, underwent his own transformation. The experience with Margaret had reminded him why he had started playing piano in the first place. Not for fame or money, but for the pure joy of making beautiful music. He began performing at community centers and schools, sharing his gift with audiences who might never have been able to afford Carnegie Hall tickets. 6 months later, Margaret released her first album, a collection of classical pieces recorded on a beautiful Steinway in a professional studio. The album became a bestseller, but more importantly, it captured the same emotional authenticity that had moved the Carnegie Hall audience that night. Alexander and Margaret remained friends, occasionally performing together at special events. Their unlikely partnership had taught both of them valuable lessons about music, humility, and the importance of remaining open to surprises. Margaret never moved away from her small house in Millfield, Ohio, though she could now afford much grander accommodations. She continued to practice on her old upright piano in the basement, but now she also had a beautiful baby grand in her living room for special occasions. The story of that night at Carnegie Hall became legendary in classical music circles, told and retold as an example of how talent can emerge from the most unexpected places and how prejudice can blind us to the extraordinary gifts that surround us every day. Most importantly, Margaret's performance reminded everyone who heard it of a simple truth her grandmother had taught her long ago. Music truly is the language that speaks to the soul, and it belongs to anyone who approaches it with genuine love and respect.